in our Old Testament reading today. Moses knows that his time with Israel in the desert, in the wilderness, is coming to an end. And just as Jesus will do with his disciples as he journeys from the Mount of Transfiguration to Jerusalem, through the wilderness, towards the cross, Moses is telling the people of Israel what they need to remember as they prepare to enter the promised land, without him there being his guide, their guide. He reminds them first of their journey out of captivity and God's faithfulness. He then spends a large portion of the book of Deuteronomy explaining then the Ten Commandments and their role in the maintaining of a right relationship with God and their neighbor. Today we listen briefly as he offers a little instruction and reminds them the importance of that fourth commandment. Observe the Sabbath day. Keep it holy. 6 days they shall work, he says, but on the seventh they are to rest. The people of Israel, their servants, their livestock, all are not to do any work on the Sabbath, as it is a day set aside for the Lord. When we were in Jerusalem 2 weeks ago, we're driving through the city on the Sabbath day, on Saturday. And things were hustling and bustling with activity. However, driving past one part of the town, we ran across roads that had these barriers across them. And we asked our guide what did that mean, and he told us that these are the Orthodox neighborhoods. On the Sabbath, they would isolate themselves from the world around them to observe not just a day of rest, a day in which they use no electricity or any mechanized instruments, but also a day of remembrance. And that kind of goes with how I understood the Sabbath, as a day in which we look back at what God has done for us, not just historically, but in our time and in our lives. For it is in remembering the past that we are able to see more clearly the present and better prepare for the future. And one cannot do this if one is busily doing this or that. If we were to read the 39 Melachot, the works that are prohibited by Jewish tradition on the Sabbath, we would see that we really weren't able to do much more than be with our family, with our community, and with our God. By the way, reading is not on their list of 39 works to be avoided. That's because the Sabbath was also supposed to be a day in which you studied the Scriptures in order to deepen one's relationship and understanding of God. Since all modes of transportation involve some type of mechanized item, or the efforts of livestock, the only way to get around on the Sabbath by Jewish tradition is on foot. However, with the sense of community being an important aspect of the Sabbath, how far one walks is limited. Not so limited, though, that they can't get to the nearby synagogue to hear the Scriptures being read, to discuss what they mean. In fact, from what I have read, the synagogue in the time of Jesus was much like a community gathering place, a hangout, if you will, especially on the Sabbath. You see, not everyone could read. So they would come to the synagogue to hear the Scriptures read and to learn more of their relationship with God, God's creation, and one another. It was a place not just of worship, but of learning, of debate. It was also a place community people could come and seek the help of those in community. Modern-day Orthodox Jews, like the Pharisees in the day of Jesus, strive to live into the image of holy that Moses describes. And in doing so, they strive to keep that Sabbath day holy. That's why today you see roadblocks going into the neighborhoods. And that is why the Pharisees, in our gospel reading today, were so upset with Jesus' disciples as they walk through the fields plucking the heads of grain as they go along the way. You see, doing any kind of work in the fields is at the top of that list of 39 things prohibited by Jewish tradition on the Sabbath. Let me share something about the Pharisees real quick that you may not know. The Pharisees were not clerics. They were not priests. They are what we would describe today as the theologians of their day. They would separate themselves to a degree so that they could deeply study the scriptures so that they might live more faithfully into God's will as described. Oh, and be able to instruct others in how they should be doing the same. This is one reason Jesus gets so upset with the Pharisees. They know the law. The little things, the big things, they know it better than anyone. Yet they have forgotten why the law was given in the first place. So when Jesus tells them that the Sabbath is made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath, it goes right over their head. Instead of being the light in the world they were called to be, they had used the law to build barriers around that light to protect it from the world. And Jesus challenges this form of isolationism when he enters the synagogue. And seeing the man there with the withered hand, turns to the Pharisees and asks, is keeping the law more about our individual self-righteousness or about our relationship within community? They know the answer. But to say what they know is right in their heart would give credence to the message Jesus proclaimed. So they kept silent. Seeing their stubbornness, Jesus heals that man without hesitation. In Capernaum, we walked into the synagogue. These events are supposed to have taken place. Well, at least a 4th century rebuild on the same foundation of that synagogue. And the main space there really wasn't that much larger than the footprint of our own church. There's something that these two buildings had in common. Just inside the main doors was this gathering space before you get to the seats where people would sit and learn. And they would have a greeter, much like we do. That greeter's job was to direct women to their portion of the synagogue and men to theirs. Oh, they had one other job. They kept out those who did not belong. Their role then, as today to a large degree, was to guide the people of God to where they could find community in the presence of God. Those seeking help, they would have typically sat on the stairs outside of the synagogue. Or if they were lucky, maybe just inside the door in that gathering space, as the man with the withered hand had done. Unlike today, those in need would not have been welcome in the midst of the community. They would have been kept on the fringe or even outside, so as not to distract the study and worship of those deemed acceptable in the eyes of the community. in healing the man with the withered hand, Jesus not only challenges their self-righteousness, but he makes it clear that everyone is welcome in the house of God. In fact, he shows that it is the community's responsibility when seeing a need for others to care for those needs. This isn't a new teaching. Hospitality was a core aspect of that culture in those days. But you see, they'd become too comfortable in their self-righteousness. And like the reasoning behind the law, they had forgotten. They had forgotten what being God's chosen people meant. As Paul makes clear in his letter to the people of Corinth, being chosen by God is not a position of privilege. It is a position of servitude. Servitude to God and to the world in which we live. Have we, like the Pharisees, forgotten this? I hope not. But when we see needs, be they out in the world or within our own community, and we turn our head away, choosing not to see what is before us, or leaving it for someone else to deal with, we fall short. Is it hard to place the needs of others, of the community, of God, above all those things we think are so important in our lives? You bet. I guess, as Jesus demonstrates in the gospel today, it comes down to our priorities. Moses reminds Israel their priority is to set aside time each week to maintain and strengthen their relationship with God and one another. And Jesus says, if we live in the land of me first, then we've got our priorities backwards. Where does that leave us? That's a good question. One maybe we each should ask ourselves, both individually and as a community. But the good news is, if we accept the grace that God so freely offers, we can overcome those things that cause us to fall short. And in doing so, deepen our relationship with God and one another. And as we do this, we also help others to do the same. Amen.
Amen.